Kentucky night settles over Louisville, Kentucky, and on the hilltop where the Waverly Hills Sanatorium still stands, the silence feels wrong. The building looms like a corpse of concrete and steel, its windows hollow and lifeless, yet filled with the weight of unseen eyes. Locals say that when the wind cuts across the empty corridors, it carries with it the cries of the thousands who once suffered there, patients who came seeking hope but found only death. The sanatorium was built to heal, yet its walls became a tomb for the diseased, the desperate, and the forgotten. For many, their final breath was stolen in the endless battle against tuberculosis. For others, madness and grief consumed them long before the disease did. Some whisper that their anguish never left, seeping into the very bones of the building. Visitors today report hearing screams that do not belong to the living. Others speak of black shadows that step out of the walls and follow them down pitch-dark hallways. Some leave shaken and silent. Others never return at all. What waits inside Waverly Hills is not history. It is hunger. The story of Waverly Hills begins not with ghosts, but with disease. In the early 1900s, tuberculosis swept across Kentucky like a silent plague. Families were torn apart, entire communities left in mourning. Louisville, sitting low by the river, became a breeding ground for the illness. The city needed a place to quarantine the sick, and so, in 1910, the Waverly Hills Sanatorium opened its doors. It was meant to be a beacon of hope. Patients were promised fresh air, sunlight, and care away from the city's suffocating smoke. The grounds themselves seemed peaceful at first glance, built high on a hill surrounded by trees. But behind the promise of healing lay something darker. Tuberculosis was merciless, and medicine was primitive. Hope often gave way to despair, and soon the halls of Waverly were filled with suffering that stretched day and night. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly, but their methods were brutal by today's standards. Lungs were collapsed intentionally. Ribs were surgically removed to ease breathing. Patients endured experimental procedures, often without relief. Many died not from the disease itself, but from the desperate attempts to cure it. By the 1920s, Waverly Hills had grown into a massive complex, a self-contained world with its own post office, farmland, and morgue. Yet for all its size and resources, the death toll only climbed. Corpses were carried away through what became known as the body chute, a tunnel designed to hide the constant stream of the dead from those still clinging to life. For the thousands who entered Waverly Hills, few ever left. And those who did carried scars, both on their bodies and deep within their minds. It is said that such relentless suffering leaves an imprint, a wound on the earth itself. And that wound never truly healed. Even before the sanatorium closed, whispers spread through Louisville. Shadows were seen where no one stood. Voices were heard where no mouth spoke. Waverly was no longer just a hospital. It was becoming something else, something alive. Not long after the first patients filled the wards of Waverly Hills, the whispers began. Nurses spoke in hushed voices about hearing footsteps pacing the hallways at night, long after every patient had been confined to bed. The sounds were sharp, deliberate, yet when investigated, the corridors stood empty. Some dismissed it as the building's settling, but others knew better. Patients themselves started to report strange encounters. A young woman claimed that she often woke to see a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed. It never moved, never spoke, yet its presence drained her of sleep and breath until she wasted away faster than the disease demanded. Another patient, a boy no older than 12, told his mother that a man without eyes followed him in the hallways. His mother thought the fever was causing hallucinations until she, too, saw the shape in the doorway one night, watching, waiting. Staff began to notice that certain rooms seemed colder than others, even in summer when the Kentucky heat pressed hard against the walls. Drafts whispered through closed doors, and shadows clung unnaturally to corners. Light bulbs burned out faster in those areas, and the air itself seemed heavy, suffocating, as if unseen lungs pressed in against the living. Some of the earliest deaths at Waverly carried peculiar details. Patients were discovered lifeless in their beds, their faces contorted in silent screams, as though something had stolen their last breath. Others leapt from windows or tried to claw their way through locked doors, desperate to escape something that no one else could see. Word began to spread among the staff. Waverly was not just a place of medicine. It was a place where the suffering of the living brushed too close to the veil of the dead. The line between this world and the next blurred inside those walls, and whatever crossed over seemed unwilling to leave. The hospital had only just begun, yet already a presence had awakened. And with every death, with every cry that echoed down the endless corridors, that presence grew stronger, hungrier. By the late 1920s, the unease inside Waverly Hills had shifted into something undeniable. What began as whispers and fleeting shadows became open torment. Entire wards carried a sense of dread so thick that patients begged to be moved elsewhere. The doctors denied them, insisting the mind was fragile and prone to tricks. But the nurses knew. At night, they heard the screams, not the agonized cries of patients coughing blood, but something different, inhuman, distorted, echoing through the ventilation shafts. The sounds crawled down the corridors like claws dragging across stone. Sometimes, the screams seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The body chute became another place of fear. Workers tasked with moving corpses reported the sensation of being followed through the tunnel, even when no one else was inside. Their lanterns flickered, shadows stretched unnaturally long, and whispers slipped into their ears in voices they recognized, sometimes a patient who had died only hours before. One nurse confessed to hearing her own name called in the dark, soft and pleading. She swore it was the voice of a patient she had watched die earlier that day. Another member of staff refused to descend into the chute at all, insisting that something waited in its depths, something that reached for the living. Even the architecture of Waverly seemed to turn against its inhabitants. Doors jammed without reason. Windows slammed, shut with no wind to move them. The building groaned at night like a wounded beast, and those inside swore they could feel it breathing. Fear spread silently. Patients clutched crucifixes and whispered prayers. Nurses walked in pairs, avoiding certain hallways at all costs. The sanatorium had become more than a house of sickness. It had become a breeding ground for terror, feeding on despair, on fear, on death itself. And soon, the shadows would no longer remain content to be seen from a distance. They wanted more. The first direct encounters came suddenly and with violence. In one ward, a patient awoke in the middle of the night to find his blanket being pulled slowly off his body. He clutched it, terrified, but the unseen hands yanked harder until the blanket slid to the floor. In the silence that followed, he swore he heard faint laughter, childlike yet cruel. By morning, he was gone, found collapsed in the corner, eyes wide open, body cold. Another patient, a woman in her 30s, screamed so loudly that nurses rushed into her room. She was clawing at her own skin, shrieking that something was crawling over her, something with long fingers and a face she refused to describe. They restrained her, but she never recovered, sinking into madness until her death weeks later. The staff themselves were not spared. A nurse making her rounds late one evening felt a presence close behind her. She turned, expecting another member of staff, but instead saw only a tall, dark figure standing in the corridor. It had no face, only an empty void where eyes should have been. She dropped her tray of instruments and fled, but the memory never left her. There were reports of doors slamming shut on their own, trapping people inside rooms for hours. Others described cold hands brushing against their skin, whispers pressing into their ears, and a suffocating sense of being watched by something intelligent, something that fed on fear. It wasn't just haunting anymore. The shadows of Waverly Hills had crossed the line between observer and predator. They reached out, touched, and claimed. And as the encounters grew more violent, the line between the living and the dead was no longer clear. Waverly Hills had become a prison, not just for the sick and dying, but for anyone who dared to enter. The terror of Waverly Hills was never confined to rumors alone. Survivors, patients, staff, and visitors alike carried memories so vivid that even decades later their voices trembled when they spoke of it. One former nurse recalled hearing a child's laughter echoing down a deserted hallway. She followed the sound, lantern trembling in her hand, until she reached a playroom where the children's toys still lay scattered. The laughter stopped, then a ball rolled slowly across the floor toward her, though the room was utterly still. She dropped her lantern and fled, convinced something unseen had been waiting for her in the dark. A former patient, interviewed years after his release, swore that the shadows of the dead walked alongside the living. He remembered lying in bed one night, hearing the gurneys roll down the hallway. When he peered through the crack of his door, he saw not nurses pushing the carts, but figures draped in black, moving silently toward the chute. The faces of the bodies they carried glowed pale in the lantern light, and one of them was his roommate, who had been alive only hours before. Even visitors who came later, long after the hospital shut down, reported the same horrors. One group of explorers claimed they heard footsteps pacing above them, though they were on the top floor. Another swore that the walls themselves whispered, low voices repeating prayers, chants, and cries for help that grew louder the longer they lingered. What makes these accounts chilling is not just their detail, but their consistency. Strangers separated by time and experience described the same shadows, the same laughter, the same suffocating presence that stalked every hallway. Waverly Hills had consumed thousands of lives, and it seemed the building had no intention of letting their screams fade into silence. Behind every haunting lies a history of suffering. At Waverly Hills, that suffering was unrelenting. Over 60,000 deaths are said to have occurred within its walls, each one a story of pain, despair, and abandonment. And with every passing year, the sanatorium's legacy grew darker. Some of the worst stories came from the 5th floor. It was said to house the mentally ill patients, those driven to madness either by the disease or by the endless isolation. One nurse was found hanging from a light fixture there, her body swaying gently in the draft. Some whispered it was suicide. Others swore her face bore a look of terror, as if she had seen something unspeakable in her final moments. To this day, that hallway is said to be the most cursed part of Waverly. Then there were the experiments. Doctors, desperate to find cures, subjected patients to brutal procedures, removing ribs, collapsing lungs, or exposing them to raw sunlight for hours until their skin blistered. Many did not survive the treatment, and those who did were left broken, both in body and spirit. The sanatorium was meant to heal, but it became a place of torment. And through it all, the body's chute never ceased. The dead were wheeled into its depths at all hours, their final descent hidden from the living. Workers who labored there spoke of the tunnel's air being heavy, charged, as though the grief of thousands had soaked into its very stones. It is no wonder that the souls of Waverly lingered. They had been given no peace in life, and in death, they were bound to the halls that betrayed them. The sanatorium was supposed to be a refuge. Instead, it became a mausoleum of despair. And despair, once rooted, never lets go. Even after Waverly Hills closed its doors in 1961, the dead never seemed to leave. Decades later, when the abandoned building became a site of exploration, curiosity seekers and paranormal investigators found themselves facing the same horrors that once plagued patients and staff. Visitors describe hearing the echo of gurney wheels rolling down empty corridors, the clatter of metal against tile, sounds that vanish the moment light is shown down the hall. Some claim to see doors swing open on their own, revealing rooms filled with shadows that ripple as if alive. One of the most infamous encounters comes from the 4th floor. Paranormal teams report hearing faint voices call out their names, the sound creeping closer until the darkness feels suffocating. Many refuse to return to that level, convinced something waits in the blackness, intelligent and malicious. Another recurring presence is that of a small boy named Timmy. Visitors bring balls for him to play with, only to watch in horror as the toys roll on their own across the floor. Some laugh nervously, calling it a trick of gravity, but others describe seeing a small figure dart through the shadows, too quick to follow, too silent to be flesh and blood. Cameras and audio devices often malfunction inside Waverly Hills. Batteries drain instantly, voices are captured on tape that were never spoken, and shapes appear in photographs where no one was standing. Those who leave often speak of being followed home by a heaviness, as if the shadows of Waverly had decided to keep watch even beyond its walls. The building stands abandoned, but it is far from empty. Every visitor adds another layer to its legend, another testimony to its hunger. Waverly Hills is not content with the past. It still reaches for the living. The horrors of Waverly Hills have inspired endless debate. Paranormal believers insist the building is a nexus of suffering, a place so saturated with death that it has become a doorway between worlds. To them, every cry in the halls is a soul trapped in endless agony. Every shadow a remnant of the countless lives extinguished there. Some believe the land itself is cursed, stained long before the sanatorium was built. They point to the unnatural chill in certain rooms, the oppressive weight in the air, and the consistency of reports across decades. To them, Waverly is not merely haunted. It is alive, a predator feeding on grief and fear. Skeptics offer different explanations. They claim the building's design, with its long echoing hallways and broken architecture, creates illusions of sound and shadow. Drafts from shattered windows cause doors to slam, and the body's natural fear in such a place heightens every sensation. Hallucinations, they argue, are born of suggestion, fear, and the dark reputation of Waverly itself. Yet, skepticism falters against the sheer volume of accounts. Too many witnesses, separated by time and reason, describe the same apparitions, the same whispers, the same suffocating dread. Are they all imagining the same details? Or is something far more sinister binding their stories together? Some paranormal experts speak of residual hauntings, echoes of past suffering replayed endlessly without awareness. Others, however, believe the entities at Waverly are intelligent, conscious, and vengeful. They point to the encounters where shadows seem to respond, where voices call names, where unseen hands reach out and touch. Whether psychological or supernatural, one truth remains. No one who enters Waverly leaves unchanged. The human mind may explain away a creak or a shadow, but not the cold breath on the back of your neck, nor the whisper of your name in an empty hallway. Waverly Hills defies explanation, and perhaps that is its most terrifying power. Today, Waverly Hills stands as both a decaying monument and a thriving legend. Its looming presence on the hilltop, framed by trees that seem to bend away from it, continues to draw thousands every year. Some come out of curiosity, others out of thrill-seeking, and many arrive with solemn reverence for the suffering that once unfolded within its walls. Ghost tours and paranormal investigations are now common at the site, with groups gathering in the night to walk its darkened halls. The stories of screams echoing through the tunnels, of children's laughter in abandoned wards, and of shadow figures watching from broken windows keep its reputation alive. For many, it is not just a haunted location. It is one of the most haunted places in America. But Waverly Hills is more than a tourist attraction. For locals, it is a scar on the landscape, a reminder of how fragile life once was during the days of tuberculosis. Families still speak in hushed tones about relatives who died there, about loved ones wheeled down the infamous body chute beneath the hospital. For them, Waverly is not entertainment. It is memory, grief, and the ghost of a past they cannot escape. Even among seasoned investigators, the building has a reputation for breaking spirits. Some leave convinced they have spoken with the dead. Others refuse to ever return, shaken by something they cannot explain. Its legend continues to spread across books, television, and whispered tales, ensuring its place in horror history. Decades have passed, but Waverly Hills has never lost its grip on fear. It does not fade with time. It grows, feeding on stories, feeding on belief. As long as people continue to enter those halls, the asylum's legacy will remain alive, echoing with screams that refuse to be silenced. Waverly Hills Sanatorium is more than crumbling brick and broken glass. It is a monument to suffering, a labyrinth of shadows where the line between past and present has dissolved. Every whisper, every flicker of movement, every icy breath in the dark reminds us that death is not always the end. Sometimes it lingers. Sometimes it hunts. Those who have dared to enter speak of leaving with more than memories. Some carry scars of fear that never heal. Others claim the shadows follow them home, watching from corners, whispering in dreams. Whether these stories are imagination or proof of something darker, one truth cannot be denied. Waverly Hills is alive in the minds of all who hear its name. So what do you believe? Are the screams in the night only echoes of history? Or are they the voices of restless souls, still waiting, still suffering, still searching for the living? The story of Waverly Hills is far from over. And as long as its walls stand, the dead will never stop calling. Tell us, would you dare to walk those halls alone? Or would you turn back at the first sound of footsteps in the dark?